The door clicked shut behind them, and Frank Sinatra realized he'd just made the kind of mistake that destroys everything. Ava Gardner stood 3 feet away, still wearing that emerald dress from the party downstairs, and neither of them had said a word since the elevator. The hotel suite felt smaller than it should, too quiet, too dangerous. Frank's wedding ring caught the dim light from the window, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't think of a single thing to say. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the photographer he'd seen in the lobby, the one who'd looked up from his newspaper just as they'd walked past, the one whose eyes had widened with recognition before he'd grabbed his camera bag. They had maybe 10 minutes before that photograph existed, maybe less. Ava moved to the window, her silhouette sharp against the Los Angeles skyline. She didn't look at him. That scared him more than anything she could have said. He'd built an empire on reading rooms, reading audiences, reading exactly what people wanted from him before they knew it themselves. But Ava Gardner didn't work that way. She never had. 3 months of stolen phone calls, 5 secret meetings in places where nobody was supposed to recognize them, and now this, a hotel room. A decision that couldn't be unmade, a door that once closed might never open to the life he'd carefully constructed. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Frank reached for his cigarettes, more out of habit than desire. His hands didn't shake. They never did. Not on stage, not in recording booths, not even during the worst nights of his career when the audiences had stopped showing up and the critics had written him off as finished. But they wanted to shake now. He could feel the tremor waiting just beneath the surface, ready to betray everything he was trying to hide. Ava finally turned. Her eyes met his, and there it was, the question she hadn't asked yet. The one that would change everything depending on how he answered. The one he'd been avoiding for 3 months because once it was spoken out loud, there would be no more pretending this was just attraction, just chemistry, just 2 people who'd found something unexpected in the chaos of Hollywood. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then walked past him to the bar cart in the corner, her perfume cutting through the stale air of the suite. Ice clinked against glass. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Frank watched her pour 2 drinks with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this before, stood in a hotel room, poured whiskey for 2, waited for a married man to decide between his life and her. But here's what nobody knew. Here's what the gossip columnists would never print, what the fan magazines would never publish, what even the people closest to them would never fully understand. This wasn't about romance. It wasn't about passion or desire or any of the words that would eventually get attached to their names in headlines. This was about power, about control, about 2 people who'd spent their entire lives performing for audiences, shaping narratives, playing roles, finally finding someone who saw through all of it and didn't look away. Ava handed him the glass. Her fingers didn't touch his, deliberate. "They saw us," she said, not a question, a statement. Flat, clinical. The voice of someone who'd already calculated every possible outcome and knew exactly how this would end. Frank took the glass, took a drink. The whiskey burned in a way that felt almost comforting, almost normal, almost like something from the life he understood. The life where he controlled the room, called the shots, decided when the curtain fell. Maybe. Don't. That one word carried more weight than any speech she could have given. Don't lie. Don't soften it. Don't treat me like one of your fans who believes whatever you tell them. Ava set her glass down on the windowsill and crossed her arms. The gesture should have looked defensive. On her it looked like armor. The phone rang. Neither of them moved. It rang again, and again. Frank knew that sound. Knew what it meant when a phone rang in a hotel room at 1 in the morning. Knew who would be on the other end. His manager, or his wife's friend, or worse, his wife herself, who'd been asking questions lately, who'd been looking at him differently, who'd stopped believing his excuses about late recording sessions and business dinners. On the 5th ring, Ava walked over and picked up the receiver. She didn't say anything, just listened. Her face didn't change. After 10 seconds, she placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting off whoever was on the other end mid-sentence. "Wrong room," she said. They both knew that was a lie, but lies were easier than the alternative. Lies kept doors open. Lies bought time. Lies let you pretend for just a few more minutes that you hadn't already crossed the line you swore you'd never cross. Frank moved to the couch, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. He'd performed 3 shows this week, done 2 radio spots, attended 4 industry events, smiled for approximately 7,000 photographs, and none of it had drained him the way these 5 minutes in this hotel room had drained him. But here's what nobody tells you about moments like this. The kind that show up in biographies years later, sanitized and simplified into neat little anecdotes. They don't feel dramatic while they're happening. They feel mundane.
Tedious.
Like watching paint dry or waiting for a verdict you already know. The real weight doesn't hit until later, when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying every word, every gesture, every decision, trying to figure out which exact second everything changed. Ava sat down across from him, not next to him. The distance felt intentional.
Strategic.
She'd learned early in her career how to use space as a weapon, how to make people come to her instead of the other way around. Frank had always admired that about her, had always respected the way she refused to play by the rules everyone else followed. But right now, in this moment, he wanted her to close the distance, wanted her to make this easier, wanted her to be the one who said what they were both thinking. She didn't. "You're going to leave," she said instead. Statement, not question. The kind of prediction that sounds casual but lands like an accusation. Frank looked at his watch. 12:47. His car was waiting downstairs. His driver had instructions to take him to the studio by 1. He had a recording session at 8 in the morning. Had to be sharp, focused, ready to deliver the kind of performance that would remind people why they'd fallen in love with his voice in the first place. Had to prove that he wasn't finished, wasn't washed up, wasn't yesterday's news. But none of that mattered right now. None of that existed in this room. "I don't know," he said. And that was the truth. The first real truth he'd spoken all night. Maybe in months. He genuinely didn't know what he was going to do. Didn't know if he was going to stand up, walk out that door, and pretend this night never happened. Didn't know if he was going to stay, let whatever this was play out, and deal with the consequences in the morning. Didn't know if he even had a choice anymore, or if the choice had been made the moment he'd suggested they leave the party together. Ava leaned back, studying him with the kind of intensity that made lesser men uncomfortable. Frank had been studied before, by critics, by audiences, by rivals looking for weakness. But this was different. This was someone seeing past the performance, past the carefully constructed image, straight through to the parts of himself he kept locked away. "You know what I think?" she said. Her voice had changed, softer now, almost gentle. The kind of gentleness that made you drop your guard right before the knife went in. "I think you're terrified." Frank smiled. Couldn't help it. The absurdity of it. Ava Gardner, Hollywood's most dangerous woman, sitting in a hotel room telling Frank Sinatra he was afraid, as if fear was something new to him. As if he hadn't been afraid every single day since his voice first started bringing crowds, since success had turned him into something larger than himself, since people had started expecting more than he knew how to give. Of what? Of what happens if you're happy? The words hit harder than they should have, all landed in a place he didn't know was vulnerable. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, she didn't understand, she was projecting her own issues onto him, but he couldn't, because she was right. Terrifyingly, devastatingly right. Frank Sinatra had built a career on longing, on singing about love just out of reach, happiness that slipped through fingers, moments that ended too soon. His voice worked because it carried weight, carried loss, carried the ache of wanting something you couldn't have. And here was Ava Gardner, the one thing he genuinely wanted, sitting close enough to touch, asking him what would happen to that voice if the longing disappeared. The phone rang again. This time, Frank stood up and yanked the cord from the wall. The silence that followed felt like a small victory, like reclaiming some fragment of control in a situation that had spiraled past his ability to manage it. Ava watched him, but didn't comment. She reached for her drink again, took a slow sip, and Frank realized she was giving him time, letting him think, letting him work through whatever internal calculation he was running. She'd always been good at that, at knowing when to push and when to wait. It was one of the things that made her dangerous, one of the things that made her impossible to forget. "The photographer," Frank said finally. "If he got the shot, he got it. You don't know that." "I know how these things work." Ava set her glass down with a soft clink. "By tomorrow morning someone will have offered him $5,000 for that negative. By tomorrow afternoon it'll be on every editor's desk in Los Angeles. By tomorrow night your wife's lawyer will have a copy. She wasn't being cruel, just realistic. Ava had been through enough scandals to know exactly how the machinery worked, how fast information traveled, how quickly careers could shift from ascending to crashing, how one photograph could undo years of careful image management. Frank walked back to the window. The city sprawled below them, millions of lights marking millions of lives, and not one of those people knew or cared that Frank Sinatra was standing in a hotel room, watching his carefully constructed world crack apart. They had their own problems, their own mistakes, their own moments of standing at crossroads, trying to figure out which direction led to salvation and which led to destruction. But here's the thing about crossroads that nobody tells you. The thing that doesn't show up in the stories later, when people talk about pivotal moments and life-changing decisions. Most of the time, you don't actually choose. Most of the time, something chooses for you. A phone call, a photographer, a wife who stops pretending she doesn't know, a career that demands sacrifices you didn't agree to make. "What do you want from me?" Frank asked. He didn't turn around, couldn't look at her while asking, couldn't risk seeing her face when she answered. The silence stretched so long he thought maybe she wasn't going to respond. Then he heard her stand, heard her heels against the carpet, felt her presence behind him, close enough that her breath touched the back of his neck. "I want you to stop performing." "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." And he did. God help him. He did. She wasn't talking about his career, about the shows and the recordings and the public appearances. She was talking about this, about them, about the way he kept treating their relationship like another audience to win over, another performance to nail, another role to play perfectly. Frank turned. Ava was closer than he'd realized, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the tiny scar above her left eyebrow that makeup usually covered, the way her jaw tightened when she was trying not to show emotion. This close, she looked less like the Hollywood icon and more like a woman who'd gambled on the wrong person and knew it but couldn't quite bring herself to fold. "I don't know how to do that," he said. "I know, so what happens now?" Ava reached up and touched his face, just her fingertips, barely making contact, but Frank felt it everywhere, felt it in his chest, in his throat, in the parts of himself he kept carefully controlled and locked away. Her hand dropped. "Now you leave," she said. "You go home. You do your recording session. You fix things with your wife, or you don't. You tell the truth, or you lie. And I go back to my life, and we pretend this was just another Hollywood affair that didn't mean anything. Is that what you want?" What I want stopped mattering the moment that photographer saw us. She moved past him, back to her drink, back to the window, creating distance again, rebuilding walls. Frank recognized the defense mechanism. He'd used it himself 1,000 times. When audiences turned cold, when critics sharpened their knives, when the people you trusted looked at you like you were yesterday's news. But here's what made this different. Here's what made this moment matter in ways that would echo for years after, long after the headlines faded and the scandal became just another footnote in two complicated lives. Frank Sinatra, for maybe the first time since he'd become Frank Sinatra, didn't have a plan, didn't have an angle, didn't have a carefully calculated next move that would turn disaster into opportunity. He had nothing but the truth, and the truth was terrifying. "I love you," he said. The words came out wrong, too quiet, too uncertain, not at all like the confident declarations he sang about in ballads, the smooth promises he delivered to audiences who believed every word. This sounded raw, unfinished, like something ripped out before it was ready. This sounded raw, unfinished, like something ripped out before it was ready. Ava didn't turn around, didn't react at all for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he almost missed it. "I know." "Then why?" "Because love isn't enough, Frank. It never has been." She was right. Of course she was right. Love didn't pay mortgages or save careers or undo photographs or silence gossip columnists. Love didn't fix broken marriages or erase public commitments or make complicated situations simple. Love was just love, messy and insufficient and nowhere near enough to build a life on. The clock on the wall ticked past 1. Frank's driver would be wondering where he was. His manager would be calling soon, if he wasn't already trying to track him down. His wife was probably awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing without being told that something had shifted, something had changed, Something had broken in a way that couldn't be repaired with apologies and excuses. Frank reached for his jacket. The movement felt mechanical, rehearsed, like he was following a script someone else had written, playing a role he didn't fully understand but knew he had to complete. His fingers found the fabric, lifted it, put it on, each gesture precise and empty. Ava watched him in the window's reflection, still hadn't turned around. Frank wanted to say something, wanted to make this moment mean something more than just another failed affair, another Hollywood scandal, another mistake in a career full of them. But what could he possibly say that would matter? What words existed that could change the fundamental mathematics of their situation? He walked to the door, put his hand on the knob, felt the cool metal against his palm and thought about how many doors he'd opened in his life, how many rooms he'd entered and exited, how many thresholds he'd crossed, and how none of them had ever felt quite like this one. Frank, he stopped, didn't turn around, couldn't. That photograph, Ava said, when it comes out, when they ask you about it. Yeah? Don't lie. What should I say? Tell them it was worth it. Frank opened the door. The hallway stretched ahead of him, empty and bright and ordinary, like a portal back to reality, back to the life where he was Frank Sinatra, controlled and calculating, always one step ahead, never caught off guard. The life where this night would become just another story, just another headline, just another scandal that would eventually fade into the background noise of fame. But he knew that was a lie, knew that whatever happened next, however this played out, he would never forget this moment. This room, this woman, this feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying and utterly beyond his control. He walked out without looking back, closed the door behind him, heard the soft click of the latch catching, that tiny sound that marked the end of something that had barely begun. The hallway was silent, no photographers, no witnesses, no one to document this particular exit. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should. Frank stared at his reflection in the polished doors, trying to recognize the man looking back at him. Same face, same clothes, same wedding ring. But something had shifted, something subtle and fundamental that he couldn't quite name, but could feel in every breath. The lobby was mostly empty. A night clerk behind the desk, a couple getting their room key, an older man reading a newspaper in the corner, and no photographer, no camera, no evidence that the man Frank had seen earlier had ever existed at all. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe paranoia had gotten the better of him. Maybe this whole night was just fear and projection and his own guilty conscience creating threats that weren't actually there. Or maybe the photograph was already on its way to a dark room, already being developed, already becoming the thing that would change everything. Frank's driver stood up when he saw him coming. Didn't ask questions. Didn't comment on the time. Just opened the car door and waited for Frank to get in. Professional. Discreet. The kind of loyalty that Hollywood runs on. The car pulled away from the hotel. Frank watched it shrink in the side mirror, watched the windows grow smaller, tried to guess which one had been Ava's suite, wondered if she was still standing by that window, or if she'd already moved on, already shifted back into the version of herself that the world expected to see. They drove through empty streets, past clubs that were closing, past theaters going dark, past all the places where Frank Sinatra was supposed to exist, larger than life, confident, untouchable. The city looked different at this hour, quieter, more honest, less interested in maintaining illusions. His driver finally spoke. Home or the studio, Mr. Sinatra? Frank checked his watch. 1:23. The recording session was at 8. He could go home, face whatever waited there, deal with questions or accusations or the heavy silence of a wife who knew without being told. Or he could go to the studio, sleep on the couch in the rehearsal room, wake up early, focus on the work, pretend this night existed in some separate reality that didn't have to touch his actual life. Studio, he said. The driver nodded and changed direction. Frank leaned back and closed his eyes, but he couldn't stop seeing Ava's face, couldn't stop hearing her voice, couldn't stop feeling the weight of that moment when she'd touched his face and he'd realized that some things don't have happy endings. Some things are just beautiful and terrible and over before they really begin. The studio was dark when they arrived.
Empty, just security guards and cleaning crews, and the hollow echo of spaces designed for sound but filled with silence. Frank's footsteps rang against tile floors as he walked to his rehearsal room. Everything felt too loud, too exposed, like the building itself was judging him.
He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room smelled like cigarettes and old coffee, and the specific mustiness of a space that had absorbed too many late nights and broken dreams. The couch against the far wall looked about as comfortable as sleeping on concrete, but Frank had done worse, had slept in worse places during the lean years. During the years when no one wanted to book him, when his records weren't selling, when critics wrote obituaries for his career. He took off his jacket, loosened his tie, sat down on the couch, and stared at the microphone in the center of the room. That microphone had heard everything. Every note he'd ever sung in this space, every mistake, every moment of brilliance. Every time his voice had cracked from exhaustion or emotion, or the simple weight of being Frank Sinatra. The phone on the desk rang. Frank stared at it, counted the rings, 7, 8, 9. It stopped. 30 seconds of silence. Then it started again. This time, he answered. "Where have you been?" His manager's voice, tight, controlled. The tone that meant problems were multiplying faster than solutions. "Working." "Don't lie to me, Frank. Not tonight." "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me that photograph doesn't exist." So it was real. The photographer, the camera, the moment that would define everything that came next. Frank felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, exactly, more like resignation. The kind that comes when you stop fighting the inevitable and start figuring out how to survive it. "I can't tell you that." Christ, a pause, papers shuffling. The sound of his manager calculating damage control, running scenarios, trying to figure out which lie would hold up longest. Who was it? Does it matter? Everything matters, Frank. Every detail, every name, every witness. You know how this works. Frank did know, had watched enough careers implode to understand the mathematics of scandal, how fast it spreads, how hard it hits, how much it costs to make it go away, assuming it can be made to go away at all. "What happens now?" Frank asked. "Now you come to my office. Now we figure out a strategy. Now we decide whether we confirm, deny, or redirect. Now we call in every favor we've got, and hope it's enough. And if it's not enough?" The silence on the other end lasted too long. Finally his manager spoke again, and this time the careful control was gone. Just exhaustion, just a man who'd been managing disasters for 20 years, and had finally hit the wall. "Then we find out how loyal your fans really are." Frank hung up. The studio was silent again, just him and the microphone and the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. He stood up and walked to the mic, adjusted the stand out of habit. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from thousands of recording sessions, thousands of performances, thousands of moments when he'd stepped up to sing and everything else had fallen away. He thought about Ava, about what she'd said about him being terrified of happiness, about performing instead of living, about the gap between the man he was and the man he pretended to be. She was right. She was always right. That's what made her dangerous. Frank closed his eyes and started to sing. No music, no accompaniment, just his voice, raw and unpolished, filling the empty studio with a melody that didn't have words yet, didn't have structure, was just sound and feeling, and everything he couldn't say any other way. This was the truth. This was what existed underneath all the performances and calculations and careful image management. This was Frank Sinatra before he became Frank Sinatra, before the fame and the pressure and the impossible expectations, before he learned that love wasn't enough and happiness was dangerous and some doors closed the moment you walked through them. He sang until his voice started to crack, until exhaustion replaced thought, until the only thing left was the music and the dark and the knowledge that morning would come too soon, bringing with it headlines and consequences and all the things he'd spent his whole life trying to avoid. But for now, in this moment, in this empty studio at 2 in the morning, Frank Sinatra was exactly who he was supposed to be. No audience, no performance, no one to impress or disappoint, just a man with a voice, singing into the void, hoping that somehow, somewhere, someone was listening. The photograph would come out. The scandal would break. His life would change in ways he couldn't predict or control. But this moment, this single, private, unwitnessed moment, belonged to him alone. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Because morning was coming, and with it, everything else.